And good morning, everyone. This is the EEOST Capital Fund Information Session for the Small Grants Round for Nonprofit Centers. And thank you for taking the time to participate in this information session with us. My name is Teresa Jordan, and I am the Director of the Children's Investment Fund. And we co-manage this program with EEC. So we're excited for this round. Just a few logistics before we get started. All of you are on mute, and as Eugenia mentioned, we just want to make sure that if folks can stay on mute just so that you can hear the presentations and any questions that we are answering at the end of the session. If you could please use the chat at the bottom of your screen to ask a question, because there are so many of you, and we're so excited to have about 170 people right now who are listening to this session. It's hard for us to actually see anyone that may be raising their hand for a question, so we are really going to rely on the chat. We may address some of your questions throughout the webinar by typing our answers in the chat, so you could check that to see, but we will take time at the end for a live question and answer so that we're able to answer some questions. Any additional questions that we don't get to we will respond to those in writing in the next couple of weeks. So you'll see that posted on Combise. We are, as you know, recording this session. All the slides will be shared with you. It'll be posted on Combise as well. And also, we'd just like to note that these grants are for center-based nonprofit organizations only. We did notice that some of you that responded to the request for this meeting are actually family child care providers. And unfortunately, family child care providers are not eligible for this funding. So we apologize for that miscommunication. This year, there is a separate grant open to for-profit center-based organizations. So if you are a for-profit center, this particular session would not apply to you, but there is a session on Thursday, November 30th at 11 a.m. and again at 6:30 p.m. for-profit center-based organizations that are planning to apply for this funding. And lastly, also this information center, once again, is for small grants between $200,000 and $500,000. We will be managing with EEC a large grant program for grants up to $1 million. Again, those grants will be for nonprofit center-based organizations and not family child care providers, okay? But the large grants, that information will be available soon, so stay tuned for that information. Next slide, please. So the information session, so just want to, the next slide, please, thank you. So here, again, we have a session this morning and again at 6:30 p.m. And the purpose of this session really is to go through the application process and to point out any grant conditions, to talk about changes from fiscal 23 to fiscal 24, so last year's grant round to this year's round. And we'll go through the timeline of when applications are due and any other major points that we want to make sure you understand. And here, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So presenting with me today are Jose Mendez, who is with EEC, and Kira Wilkie, who is with the Children's Investment Fund. And I will now turn it over to Jose. Next slide, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Jose Mendez. I'm the Director of Child Care Business and Facilities, and I work with CIF and CDAC to manage the EEOST program. So the EEOST program was created by an act of financing, production, preservation of housing for low and moderate income residents. As the last time it was reauthorized was back in May of 2018. The fund provides grants to tax-exempt nonprofit corporations or organizations in which a nonprofit corporation has a controlling interest, which will use the funds to develop and rehabilitate eligible facilities, in which at least 50% of the slots in the facility serve as low-income families who are eligible for public subsidy. The the finance allocated for this program is 10.8 million. For the small grant portion, approximately 6 million will be used to support applications, with the remainder being used to support upcoming large grant application. Next slide, please. So as far as the administration of the EOST Capital Fund, again, it's going to be in cooperation with CEDAC, or the Community Economic Development Assistance Corporation, and as well as with CEDAC's affiliate CIF, the Children's Investment Fund, was going to provide technical assistance and financing to ECE and OST facilities across Massachusetts. CEDAC and CIF have worked with EEC in the development of the grant review standards and will continue to administer the grants EEC awards. Since the first round in FY 14-15, the state has invested 51 million in over 110 projects across the state. This year, EOST will run 2 rounds, one for small grants, 500,000, and one for large grants up to 1 million. Next slide, please.
And Jose, I'm just jumping in to let you know, if you can speak a little slower, it'd be great for our interpreters, because it's very hard to do simultaneous interpretation. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for the reminder. Apologies for that.
No problem.
So as far as eligible applicants, eligible organization must, at the time of application, have a valid license in good standing from EEC and provide early care and education or out-of-school time care for low-income families who are eligible for public subsidy. A nonprofit, it must be organized as a nonprofit and exempt from federal income tax, Section 501c, under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, as amended, or an organization in which a nonprofit corporation has a controlling financial or managerial interest. Only Chapter 180 corporations are eligible to apply. Other 501c3 entities are not eligible if they are not incorporated under Chapter 180. None of the members, shareholders, officers, employees, or members of the board of directors of the eligible organization can profit in any way from EOST Capital Fund assistance. So as far as eligible facilities, as defined in the regulations, is a building or structure that is or will be owned or leased by one or more eligible organizations and licensed by EEC, provided that at least 50% of the slots in the facility shall serve low-income families. A leased facility shall be leased from a bona fide third party, not from an entity affiliated in any way with the eligible organization, and shall have a lease term that is consistent with the scale of the capital investment, but not less than 15 years from the date of the completion of the eligible project. And the facility shall meet all the requirements under 606 CMR 15.03. As outlined in the guidelines, eligible facilities include sites that comply with MGL 15B and all regulations and policies adopted thereunder. They also need to comply with all applicable federal, state, local statutes, regulations, and ordinances, including but not limited to the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Massachusetts State Building Code, as may be amended from time to time. And they also must serve, again, at least 50% low-income families as of the date of the EOST application. So eligible facilities as outlined in the guidelines, if a building or structure or site is leased, then the leased facility shall have a lease term that is consistent with the scale of the capital investment, but shall not be less than 15 years. If a building or structure or site is or will be a municipally owned building that dedicates a single purpose space for licensed early education or out-of-school time programs, then the lease, again, must not be for less than 15 years. So for applicants who are considering submitting an application as a partnership, a for-profit entity may act in joint venture with a nonprofit developer. The nonprofit partner is required to have at least a 51% controlling interest in the joint venture. Organizational documents of the for-profit must be provided along with a description of the nonprofit's controlling interest and the nonprofit's organizational documents. None of the members of the partnership, either for-profit or nonprofit, can profit or benefit in any way from EOST funding. So in terms of the obligations, the grant agreement will include language regarding land use obligation that ensures continued use of the property for large group and or school-aged childcare for a specific term. For all program sites, whether leased or owned, this grant term will be for 5 years at a minimum. The obligation may be released under the following conditions. Upon completion of the grant term, if a project were to be foreclosed on by a mortgage holder of a bona fide first mortgage, with EEC's consent, or in the event of a grant recapture. So some of the provisions under the recapture or repayment of the funds, if the eligible project or facility is found to be in non-compliance with any EEC regulation or policy, the terms and provisions of the EOST grant documents or with any other federal, state, or local laws, regulations, ordinance, of policies, the grantee will have 90 days to rectify those matters in a manner acceptable to EEC prior to the recapture of grant funds. Compliance will be determined at the sole discretion of EEC. If for any reason the grantee fails to comply with the terms or provisions of the grant agreement, CDAC, CIF, or EEC will recapture the grant funds according to the schedule provided in the EOST guidelines. In the event of a default occurs on the date that is on or before the first anniversary of the completion deadline, 100% of the grant proceeds shall be recaptured and repaid to grantor. If the event of default occurs on a date that is after the first anniversary, but on or before the second anniversary of the completion deadline, 80% of the grant proceeds shall be recaptured. If the event of default occurs on or before the third anniversary of the completion deadline, 60% of the grant proceeds shall be recaptured. If the event of default occurs on or before the fourth anniversary of the completion deadline, 40% of the grant proceeds shall be recaptured. If the event of default occurs on or before the fifth anniversary of the completion deadline, 20% of the grant proceeds shall be recaptured. And if the event of default occurs after the fifth anniversary of the completion deadline, none of the grant proceeds shall be subject to recapture and repayment. So for the upcoming, I'm sorry. Let me hand it over to Teresa. Sorry about that, Teresa.
That's okay. Thanks, Jose.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's talk about the similarities from the last year, from fiscal 23, and we're in fiscal 24. So we are most interested in projects that are in the earlier stages, so projects that are not fully complete. And the reason for that is that we would like to help by providing technical assistance that might be needed in terms of whether you need, advice from an architect or a construction project manager or other folks regarding your project. So projects that focus on health and safety, emergency repairs, accessibility modifications, and security upgrades are eligible to apply for this funding. Any projects, again, that are 100% complete at the time of the application are not eligible to apply for this funding. And the major changes this year really relate to the security upgrades. That is a new category, and I will talk about that in a few moments. So security upgrades, but also the two other major changes. One is that organizations that received a grant in prior rounds, so if you received a grant in fiscal 21 or fiscal 14, you are eligible to apply again for that exact same site for funding. And then the third is that if you have multiple sites, if you have a site in Lawrence, in New Bedford, in Boston, you can apply for a grant for all 3 sites, but you must submit separate applications for each site. Okay. Next slide, please. And then in terms of the grant range, so the grants ranged between $200,000 and $500,000. So again, if you're applying for multiple sites, the applications for each site have to be at least $200,000 and not more than $500,000 when applying for EEOST. So we can fund the entire cost of a project. So if your project costs $500,000, then EEOST is the source that can pay for that work. If your project costs $600,000, what we ask that you do is to identify the other gap funding that you have there. So if it's $600,000 and you're requesting $500,000 from EEOST, then please demonstrate in your application how you will pay for, right, that additional $100,000, whether it's a bank loan or a grant from a foundation or your own equity. But that information has to be in hand, right? That funding needs to be in place at the time that you submit your application. If a project, if you have completed construction, all the work is done, then your project is not eligible to apply for this funding. So that's a really important piece here, because then we would have no way of, providing any feedback on your project if it's completely done and you're requesting funds to reimburse for the work that has been done. But if a portion of your project is done, so there's more work that needs to happen, but you've already completed a portion of it, we ask that you submit invoices and any details on what has been completed and when that work was completed. Okay. So project readiness is key to being funded. Projects that are complete, that can complete a full financial closing and start construction by March of 2025. And the date March of 2025 is, we hope that for this round, right, applications will be due in January. We have our review process through June, and we hope that in June, organizations will be notified of whether they've received a grant or not. So then 9 months from that date is March of 2025. So we expect that by March of 2025 that you will have closed on your financing and started construction. Again, at the time that you submit your application, any additional funding must be in place. So that's by January 23rd. And any complex projects, if your project entailed moving walls or doing any plumbing and electrical work, replacing your heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, any significant construction work, we expect that you have a real estate development team in place, that you have a team of folks, whether it's an architect, an HVAC engineer, and other folks, that you've been working with people already on this project. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are 6 categories, and I'll just quickly go through with an example of each. In terms of category 1, capital improvements for outdoor spaces. So if it's a playground and you're planning to replace the mulch with poured in place surfacing, that is an eligible, that would be an eligible project. For air quality, you may have inoperable windows and you would like to replace them with windows that open. The reconfiguration of indoor space, you may need to install bathrooms or sinks in classrooms. Next slide, please. Category 4 are emergency repairs. So if there's water damage due to a leaking roof and you need to replace the roof, that's an eligible cost. One thing I should note here is that there's a bullet here about information technology not being an eligible cost for EEOST, with the exception of the security system. So we understand, that there is some IT work that needs to happen for the security system. What we mean specifically here is that the funds can't be used to purchase equipment like laptops and iPads and computers, things of that nature. And then category 5 are physical environment modifications. So we've had projects that needed to improve or excuse me, make repairs to their existing elevators or put in a new mobility ramp to support the inclusion of children or adults with special needs. And then category 6, this is a new category this year. So security upgrades, security enhancements to respond to threatening situations, or just to be able to have security in your space. You might want to create a separate entry for the child care program and set up a security pad, or issue key fobs to staff or families for entry, things of that nature. So there are some examples here of what security upgrades can actually mean. And so we're excited to have that as a new category this year. And then in terms of the grant timetable and disbursement, funds will be dispersed after you close on the grant. So when I mentioned the 9 months after the grant award announcement, which again, we're hopeful that will be June, and that would give you 9 months to March of 2025, you could actually close before that, right? Anytime after June, anytime after you receive the grant award. But funds will not be dispersed until you meet all of the conditions of a conditional award letter, and then you start construction. So EEOST is dispersed on a reimbursement basis. We will pay for expenses that have incurred after January of 2023. And that's January of this year. So what that means is, specifically, if you hired an architect in February of this year, and the expenses to have that architect, determine the feasibility of the project that you're planning and start with, schematic drawings. So those expenses can be included in your requests for EEOST funds. So anything after January of 2023. And I should note there is a legal grant closing, and you can include the expense of the EEOST attorney in addition to the expense of your own attorney. So what we're seeing over the past few years is that the cost to close with our attorney and your attorney is about $5,000, a little less than in some cases. So we are recommending that you add that number into the cost, right, the total project cost. And if you need a construction manager, that's if you're doing construction. In some cases, you may not need a construction manager, but if needed, that is also an expense that can be included in your project budget as well. And again, we expect the full legal and financial closing and construction start to happen by March of 2025. And I will turn it over to Kira to talk about the development team.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the development team real quickly, and then we'll talk about the application process. So if you have a strong team working on your project, your proposal will be more competitive. So that means, depending on the complexity of the project, this team might include an architect, a mechanical engineer. Let's say if you're doing HVAC work, the attorney, because as Teresa said, there is a grant closing, which is something that's pretty unique about this grant process, and or a construction manager. So for example, if you're moving walls and you're reconfiguring classroom space, instead of just having an estimate from a contractor, we would ideally want to see that an architect came by, saw the space in person, and would ideally have what's called conceptual plans that you would attached to your application. So that would put you in a more competitive space than someone that didn't do that upfront work. We're very happy to talk to anyone up to the application date about this kind of development team and your approach, we can also try to connect you with folks if you are needing to. Next slide. So the application process, and let me pause here again, just to reiterate, I know this is a lot of information. We want to make sure that you all know that this webinar is for center-based nonprofit programs. And so if you are a family child care provider, this specific grant information is not applicable to you. There is a session tomorrow for family child care. So please, Eugenia just put it in the chat, please sign up and get the information for family child care, which is sessions tomorrow. And today, just to reiterate, we're talking about nonprofit centers. As Teresa mentioned, there's also a grant program for for-profit centers that's separate. And those information sessions are on Thursday. So you can sign up through the same link. So we know there's a lot going on. This is exciting because there's a lot of capital funding out there, but it's sort of in these different funding buckets. So I just wanted to mention that again. So for the application process for this EEOST program, just make sure you review everything on ComBuys. You know, as you know, that's the state's procurement website. There are several documents up there. There's an application checklist that talks about what you would need to attach. These applications are emailed to EEC, so there's no sort of like proposal portal online. It's by email. So we'll talk about that in a minute as well. The due date is January 23rd by the end of the evening. And then the applications are sort of transmitted to us at Children's Investment Fund to take a look at, and we start our review. Next slide. So make sure again that you are looking at the eligibility. If you have any questions, please let us know. There's a procedure for asking questions, which I'll talk about. So what we do is compile, and we know that there are tons of questions in the chat. If we don't get to your question, we will definitely get to it. We compile all the questions from this whole period. You can submit a question to EEC by December 7th. And then we repost an entire Q&A document that's posted again on around December 21st. So that'll be posted and shared on ComBuys. So you can read through that. There'll be tons of questions and answers. And make sure that if you don't get your question answered today, that you email this email, eec.eeost@mass.gov by the 7th. And then the second half of this slide just talks about how you submit your application, which is by email. You will likely have to submit several emails. We ask that you email them by numbering them, like email 1 out of 3, email 2 out of 3, email 3 out of 3, because they may be large files. You can zip them. You can, sometimes even that is too large, so you may need to set up a Dropbox. So just please give yourself some time to make sure that you can do that. There will be an automated confirmation from EEC that your application, that the email was received, but it really isn't necessarily a full confirmation that all of your emails were received. So make sure you look for a bounce back and things like that. And we'll try to confirm with everyone that we have their application more manually after that. If you have applied before, you may remember that we had an original cover page that you had to sign and mail to EEC. We're not doing that this year. You can sign something electronically and PDF it with the rest of your application instead of having to mail in a physical copy. Make sure that you get it in before the deadline. We won't consider late applications. And then for the applications that are moving forward that have a complete application and are eligible, there will be a virtual site, what we call a virtual site visit, which is just a meeting on Zoom with your team to talk through your proposal. This is a snapshot of the scoring, just so you have a sense of how we look at these applications. The first, so it's out of a 105-point scale, the first category, accurate presentation, entails us looking at all your documentation, your description, even the information that you share with us on these virtual meetings. The second category is readiness, really to, is it feasible that your project will move to start construction by March 2025? That's the target date. Financial stability, we do look at your audits and your financials. We understand the childcare business model, so we're not looking for huge surpluses or anything, but we are looking at, for example, if there have been some deficiencies found in your audit by your auditors over several years, things like that. And then for this, we are adding this year a social vulnerability index score. You may be familiar with the SVI through the C3 grant. It will be the project site that we will have a scoring for based on the SVI of the project site address. And then there are several preferences which are on the next slides. So you will get extra preference points if you are in Central Mass or on the Cape and the islands. If you have over 80% of your enrollment for low-income families receiving subsidy. And I know there's a lot of questions about low income. What does low income mean? So we're going to talk about that in a minute. You will get extra points if you serve one or more of EEC's priority populations. If you're a small agency, as defined by the SBA, and there are different kind of categories under this. So there are some tiers. So if you have an organizational budget under 5 million, for example, you would get more points than between 10 and 15 million. But we're trying to prioritize smaller organizations for this funding. If you address accessibility, you would get extra points if you're in a gateway city. And next slide. If you solicit or have someone on your team for your project that is listed, certified by the Supplier Diversity Office. So this is a state website for diverse vendors that vendors and contractors can register for if they are minority business enterprises, women-owned businesses. There's several categories. So we can actually make sure that we have a link to that in the Q&A document, so you can look that up. But we do want, and we encourage you to get estimates from diverse vendors. And then organizations that have not been previously awarded ever would get some preference points, because we do want to encourage folks to come in for the first time as well. And then, as I mentioned, this is not really a preference, but it's a separate section where we'll look at your social vulnerability index of the project site. And then a quick timeline overall, as I mentioned, we are collecting questions to the EEC email by December 7th if we don't get them answered this week. And then you'll see that huge Q&A by December 21st. The application deadline is January 23rd. We do our review, including these virtual Zoom visits. And it does need to go through to the governor's office and to some state agencies for approval. So it does take time. The target for learning about the award is July 2024. And as we mentioned, the target for projects to start construction is March 2025. And then these just next 4 slides, we're almost done with the presentation, then we'll go to your questions. These are snapshots of the spreadsheets that are included in the application. So they're all in Excel in Combis, but these are snapshots. We ask for draft budgets. So the first one is a development budget, and that refers to the what we call hard costs, which are just construction related costs, equipment, things like that, that you would list in here what your estimate is under the categories that we mentioned before that Teresa went over. So category 1, outdoor play space, category 2, air quality, and there's several down below that. and you would put in if things have been completed yet or they are to be completed. And then the second, sources and uses, is broader than that. So it's not just the construction and the hard costs. It includes what we call soft costs, which are consultant costs. So on the left-hand side, you'll see construction. And then we do encourage you to put a construction contingency, which is 10 to 15% of the construction costs. So that gives you a buffer. You really just kind of multiply by 10 to 15. It gives you a buffer in case costs increase. And then the consultant costs. So how much would you be paying for your architect, for your project manager, other things, the legal costs, environmental testing. So there's a lot to think about in how much is your total project going to cost. And again, we're happy to talk through any questions that you have about this piece or others. And on the right-hand side are your sources. So if your total project is 500,000, maybe EEOST is all of that. So you would just put 500,000 under EEOST. If your total project is 600,000, maybe you'd put 500,000 under EEOST and 100,000 under Head Start funds, for example. So it helps you and us get a sense of where all of these pieces fit together. And then we do ask for your project enrollment, the site enrollment of the site that you're focused on as of the date of the application. So license capacity from EEC is the top line number one. Number two is public subsidy in terms of EEC, voucher, contracts, or Head Start filled. A lot of programs for the number three do have their own sort of discounted slots. So you could put those under there, and then private pay slots. And the pink shaded cells will auto sum and auto calculate. So that'll help us get a sense of your overall enrollment. And then when we talk about the 50%, so the 50% threshold is pretty firm for this grant program. It means it entails either EEC, voucher, contracted slots, Head Start slots, and or these other public subsidies. So the easiest is if you have over 50% of EEC subsidy, children with EEC subsidies. If you don't, you would need to survey your families and see if they are receiving any of these other public subsidies listed. So including TAFDC, WIC, SNAP, families claiming earned income tax credit. So you would have to go through a process of surveying your families. We wouldn't ask for the actual survey data or any identifying information for your families, but you would just want to keep that on hand and be able to show that you have that amount of families with either an EEC subsidy or one of these public subsidies. And then just to reiterate, this is the last slide before we open it up to questions. We are happy to answer other questions, especially like very project specific questions or organization specific questions. You can reach us at this email. But for other questions about the application process or about EEOST, the program, please submit them to the EEC email. And as we mentioned, they need to be submitted by December 7th in order to get into the larger Q&A document. So with that, I will turn it over to Bree. We can stop sharing and I'll try to spotlight us all and we'll try to get through some questions here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for submitting your questions. I'm Bree Horowitz with the Children's Investment Fund. Please feel free to continue to submit them in the chat. And if we don't get to your question today, we will include it in the Q&A document that we will send out. The first question was whether the questions themselves will be translated into other languages. So, Jose?
Yes, questions will be translated, but of course it won't be translated instantaneously. It'll take some time, but they will be sent out.
Thank you. So there were a lot of questions about eligibility to apply. The first question was, if this is a licensed exempt organization, would they be eligible to apply? They do receive funding through EEC.
So I
Jose?
think that's a question for
Yes.
Jose. Yeah.
Sorry. So yes, unfortunately, the organizations that apply need to be licensed, not license exempt. So unfortunately, license exempt organizations will not be able to apply.
Okay. Would this question's from Nicole McLean. Is this funding only for programs with existing EEC licenses, or could the funding be used to open a new center?
So I can answer that. You would need to have a current EEC. You'd have to be a current provider. So you'd have to have a current EEC license for at least one center. The other site, you would have to demonstrate site control. You would have to have control over that site. You have to show a lease or a deed. If you're trying to open it up, it would be okay that you weren't fully operational and licensed for that site, but you would have to be a current EEC licensed provider.
Okay. I'm sorry, if it is a new site, do they need to have the new location licensed before applying here?
No. No. So if you're trying to, if you need to do renovations for that site, it would make sense that you haven't opened yet and you're not licensed. As long as you are licensed with at least another site, you are a known licensed provider with EEC.
Excellent. There was a question about whether a program could apply for a small grant program and later in the year, a large grant program for the same site. Jose?
So no, unfortunately, we're asking organizations to either apply for the small grant or apply for the large grant. So one or the other.
For the same site, but they could apply
For the same
technically
site,
for
yes.
different sites.
Yes.
Got it. Excellent. There were a lot of questions about the 50% low income slots. The first was in terms of what specific subsidies count. Would UPK count? Is there a list available of specific subsidies?
So the list is in the Excel document in Combis. It's called application spreadsheets, and it's the one that we showed on that slide. UPK is not included in that. So it would have to be in that list that's in the Excel spreadsheet that we had showed, like WIC and SNAP and all those others, but UPK is not in that.
Excellent. Let's talk again about eligibility. If an organization has a for-profit affiliate and a nonprofit arm, can they apply for both rounds? The question didn't specify whether it is the same project. And Althea, if you're on, you can raise your hand and we will put you on screen to ask if I didn't fully answer your question. Or I didn't ask your question specifically. She may not be here. Okay, we will.
Oh, she looks like she is. She is
she's
free, yeah. So go ahead, Althea.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
so my question is I have a for-profit and a nonprofit. So the for-profit is licensed through EEC, but the nonprofit is new. And yes, they both will be working on the construction. So we have a construction that we're building. It's all set. We have an engineer. We have everything. We're ready to go. We have funding with Mass Development and Life Initiative, but this grant will really help us towards the funding of our project. So could I apply with the nonprofit and the for-profit for the funding?
I suggest you apply to the for-profit round, right? Not this round for the nonprofits, but for the for-profit application.
Yeah, so the nonprofit isn't licensed through EEC, but it's a part of the same construction project with the for-profit. You know what I'm saying? because it's going to be a big community center and it's going to house the after school program, which is the for-profit, and the nonprofit is the nonprofit that's helping us build the community center.
Who holds the license?
EEC. Oh,
No,
the
no, the
oh,
for-profit or the nonprofit, which holds the
for-profit.
license?
Yeah.
The for-profit does, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, Jose, would you agree that she should apply through the for-profit application?
Yes, I do agree. You should apply for the for-profit application because the for-profit entity is the one that holds the license.
Okay. Okay. So not the nonprofit.
Correct.
Oh,
And
okay.
Althea, that's a good example of maybe if you want to email us, if you want to talk further or something, you could email us and we could follow up after as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Great question.
All right. Can the grants be used to purchase an additional space?
No, the funding cannot be used for acquisition.
Great. Let's talk about when the projects need to be completed. If a project receives the grant, can they start construction and get reimbursed? And I
If
would
they
turn that to
receive the
Teresa.
grant?
Yeah.
Oh,
If
sure.
they receive
Sorry.
the grant, yeah. And I think it's a
Yeah.
matter of timing. The person asking the question didn't specifically say when they would start construction, but if Teresa, if you could explain in terms of reimbursement, how that works.
Yeah, so if you receive a grant, one correction that I should make is I was mentioned that we're hopeful that grant awards would be made in June, but we have indicated in our application that it might be July. So if you receive a grant in July and you move through the closing process with your attorney and our attorney to meet all of the conditions, because once you receive a grant, you'll get a conditional award letter. And there will be things that you need to meet in terms of additional information that we need about your project, because there is there's a gap between January and July, and so things change with your project in terms of funding, in terms of other things that you might want to do with your project. So maybe the scope of the work has changed. You've gotten another estimate for the work as well. So we have a bunch of conditions that need to be met. Once you meet those conditions, we close with the attorneys. You've signed all of the grant materials for this award. Then you would start construction, and we pay on a reimbursement basis. So it's a little tricky in that, yes, most projects do need to front the money, need to pay their contractor as they're going along, because they may have started construction before the closing happened. But we would love to work with you more closely on your project such that we're able to review any requisitions that you're receiving from your contractor and paying that as you go along. But it's a timing issue. And so the majority of organizations are needing to pay their contractors, and then we reimburse the organization with the EEOST funding. So that would be a particular, timing issue that we can work more closely with providers on. So we understand the strain of, using your own funds, especially if we're talking about $500,000 or $200,000. So it is a lot of money that you would need to use upfront, but you should be assured that the money will come back to the organization through the reimbursement.
Great. Are multiple projects allowed within the same site, Kira?
So you may apply as it's really site specific. So you may apply for a site and you could do windows and your HVAC and propose to replace a door all within that site. Just want to clarify that you may not, under the same application, do windows in one site and an HVAC project in another site. So just think about it as one particular address that has an EEC license, and that's what you would submit an application for.
Okay, thank you. So if a project is underway now but the work isn't scheduled to be completed until late in 2024, would that project be eligible to apply?
So projects are eligible to apply as long as they are not 100% complete by the date of the application, which is January 23rd. So as long as you are not, substantially complete by January 23rd, you could apply. You would then sort of still, if you are awarded in July, you would still need to submit a lot of documentation about what has been done so far. And so it would be sort of at your own risk, obviously, that you would keep moving forward with the project, not knowing if you're funded. And then we would, as Teresa mentioned, reimburse based on what was done.
Would a sprinkler suppression system be an eligible use for EEOST?
Yes.
And there were a couple of questions about playgrounds and whether they would be eligible. A question is if the playground, what are the parameters if the playground is not immediately next to the site for which you plan to apply? Like say it's across the street, how would that be eligible?
So a provider would need to have site control of that playground. So if it is a playground that is used solely by the child care center, but it is a public playground as well, and you don't have site control, then you would not be eligible to apply for that playground. So you would have to have control of the space through a lease or what have you, or you may own it, and you would need to demonstrate that in the application.
Okay, thank you. So Kathy asks, if a program is doing major construction, such as adding a bathroom, and the program needs to be shut down for a period of time, can EEOST fund the loss of income due to the closure of classrooms during relocation? So Teresa,
So we do ask for that information. If there are any relocation expenses that are needed, they should be included in the application. So if the program needs to relocate during that, whatever, 6 months, 2 month period of time to another center, and there are expenses associated with that as the construction is going on, please include those expenses, which would be an estimate at this point, as best you can in the application.
There were a few questions about the $500,000 maximum. So is the $500,000 maximum request per agency or per site? And since there would need to be a different application for every site, I'm assuming that's what they mean. Can an organization submit several applications exceeding the $500,000 request for different sites? Yes. Kira or Teresa?
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
So
yes,
you may apply for 3 sites. Each of them can be up to $500,000. So again, it's by site. It's not $500,000 per organization overall.
And there were a few questions about the large grant round and the small grant round. And if a project cost with $600,000, say, would that project be better suited for the small project round or the large project round? So with that, I can give that to Teresa.
That's a good question. And it really depends on the extent of the work that is needed. So I would suggest that you reach out to us to have a conversation about your project specifically, just so that we can make sure that we're steering you and there won't be a lost opportunity if you don't apply for this round and wait for the large grant round. So I think it would be best if we had a conversation about that to get more information about your project. So the example I had given about a $600,000 project, if you are applying for 500 and you have identified other sources of funding for the 100,000, then I would say apply for the small grant round. But if you haven't done that and you really need to apply to EEOST for the full 600, then that would mean that you should apply to the large grant round. But it really, again, depends on the level of work that you are anticipating for this project. So please reach out to us for that discussion.
Great. I am just looking. I think we have caught up. In terms of the scope of work, if a project is looking to add a bathroom, say, to a project, would that be considered a major or a minor project? And who would they, the provider, need to hire as part of their team to complete that project?
So that type of project would most likely require the professional expertise of an architect, of a HVAC consultant, engineer as well. So it depends on the extent of the work that's needed in the bathroom, on the restroom that's being renovated. So we would suggest that you reach out to professionals for that assistance. Accessibility would be another issue to look at in the restroom as well, because you would need to meet the accessibility code for that space. So hiring an architect and getting their advice would be the first step. But yes, it's an eligible project.
Great. And then we had a question about just the process of reimbursement and how to demonstrate that. So Kira, how would they evidence that they are submitting expenses for reimbursement, and how quickly, if a project is awarded a conditional commitment in 2024, how quickly would they be able to access the funding?
Yep. So as we have discussed, there is a grant closing for this program. So that entails signing a grant agreement and having some other legal documents in place. So that's something that we would work with you on after you get awarded. You'd have to do that first. At the same time, we could be collecting invoices. You would have to show invoices and like proof of payment, like a copy of checks for all of the expenses that you have undertaken. And we could submit that sort of alongside the closing process and right after the closing process so that you could get reimbursed. So again, it is tricky with the timing. And if you want to chat more about any specifics, it really, the closing process could take a month to 3 to 4 months after your award to get completed, depending on if you have everything else in place. So it is a process.
Thank you. So this is a question for Jose.
So Bree, I think that this probably has to be the last question. I know that we're at the 12 o'clock hour. So,
oh,
yeah.
I apologize. Okay. For Jose, there was a question from Kira about whether the requirement that the projects comply with all federal, state, and local statutes. Does that specifically reference Title IX, or does it reference other statutes as well?
Sorry, you know what? I'm not familiar exactly with Title IX. I'm going to have to take that question and get back to that person.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. So we will take all of the questions submitted in the chat. If your question was not answered, we will include it in the Q&A document, as well as the questions from the other information session, which will happen tonight. Again, you can email your questions. I will put it again in the chat. Either there is a general email box for EEOST for the state and also for Children's Investment Fund, but we work together to answer the questions, and we will make sure that your questions are answered. Those will be posted on Combis on or around December 21st. But thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're thrilled to see this turnout, and best of luck with your application.